two candidates who say the same thing. The war must end.
That's right.
They both say the same thing. The war must end. But the way the war ends is totally different depending on the candidate. So Kamala Harris, the war ends with ceasefire, exchange, release of hostages, a diplomatic process that leads to a two-state solution. For Trump, the war ends by releasing all the constraints on Israel and letting Israel finish the job. I think Trump hates war. And he was willing to use force against Soleimani, against Assad. Remember the Tomahawk attack in the wake of the use of chemical weapons, what Obama wasn't willing to do. On the other hand, he pulled United States troops out of Syria overnight. He was also planning to withdraw from Afghanistan. He doesn't want to waste money on wars. He sees it in financial terms.
My guests today are Ambassador Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, and Dr. Dan Diker, president of the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for joining me here in studio to talk about the big day. U.S. elections just around the corner. So much is at stake in this very tight race between Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and his Democratic rival Kamala Harris. According to CNN's last nationwide poll before the November 5th elections, they're tied at 47% each among likely voters. Two very obviously different candidates for presidency that will determine the direction of the United States, Washington's relationship with Israel and its influence on Jerusalem, and of course, how the West tackles the region's biggest problem, Iran. Ambassador, I want to start with you and ask you, in your eyes, how much has the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza influenced this American election? And on the flip side, how will the outcome of this election influence the situation here in the Middle East?
Wow, that's quite a question to start with. Yeah, it's a full broadside. Well, let me begin by going back. For many, many years, we were proud to say that support for Israel was the only truly bipartisan issue in Washington. And I think we're strained to say that today. And it has been for a while, but now I think more emphatically. That doesn't mean that we don't have dear and committed friends on the Democratic side, and we can't afford to certainly ignore them at any point. And they fight for us hard and within their own ranks, and it's not easy for them. We often don't make it easy for them. But the reality is that Israel has become, for want of a better term, a political football, a ping pong ball, whatever kind of ball you want, we've become. It's going back and forth. And increasingly, the Republican Party has fashioned itself, not without some basis, as the pro-Israel party, and the Democrats as far less so. Kamala Harris repeats, there's a boilerplate. I strongly believe in Israel's right to exist. I fully committed to Israel's right to defend itself. And then she pauses but. And there's a string of buts. Buts for Israel has a right to defend itself, but how it does so is important. I'm just quoting for her, by the way. I'm saying nothing partisan. But the Palestinians must have a state. The Palestinians must have security and dignity, the same security and dignity that Israelis have. And the buts go on. There's a string of them, and which would be, I think, sufficiently warranting concern by pro-Israel people. But I think beyond that, the real concern is that these buts are not really attainable. So she's qualifying support for Israel and Israel's right to defend itself on goals which are largely illusory. Right? Whether the United States can turn around and create a Palestinian state tomorrow is extremely, extremely doubtful. Whether the Palestinians can be given dignity and security by result of any diplomatic initiative or executive fiat, is not really realistic. On the other hand, the Republicans, Donald Trump, who has as his record, and I see this is unassailably the most pro-Israel record of any sort of single term in office. That includes recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital, recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, which was very, very dangerous to us, and finally forging the Abraham Accords, all in 4 short years. And the big question is, should he be elected, would he revisit this approach to Israel? Would he continue? And no one can say that for certain. People who support him say, don't listen to what he says, look at what he did. But what he says sometimes can be very disconcerting. I was present at a Trump speech several weeks ago in Washington where he said, if I don't win, Israel will be annihilated in 2 years. And I guarantee that's going to happen. He said it several times, annihilated in 2 years. And if I'm not elected, then American Jews will bear responsibility for that, which could be interpreted as an incitement to a certain type of violence. Because if he loses and someone picks up a gun and says it's all because of you in this synagogue, a lot has changed in 1 year. So you asked, the impact of the war has been to accelerate the processes that were already in play and to deepen the tendencies, the polarization between the parties around support for Israel.
You mentioned those Jewish voters in America who have traditionally, as you mentioned, voted Democrat. But as we mentioned, things have changed. The October 7th attack, the ensuing Israel-Hamas war, the spike in anti-Semitism in the U.S., specifically on college campuses, have changed everything for American Jewry. Dan, we're witnessing many American Jews either jumping to the other side of the aisle from their traditional voting patterns or even deciding to abstain from voting.
There is a severe shift in the self-understanding of American Jews. It's an identity. Israel's become part of American identity politics. And the Jewish community in America, other than the Orthodox Jewish community, is really caught in a very serious bind of being a proud, patriotic Americans and being, I would call, Israel-embracing Jews. And what has happened here, because of profound shifts beginning in 2009, 2010, in the first Obama administration, you see that Israel, in the American eye, has been fashioned as a tough, uncompassionate, ill-willed, white supremacist implant in the Middle East, which is why a lot of this language that we've heard in this administration, with perhaps the best of intentions about dignity and about justice and about the rights, are all accrued to the Palestinians, because the issue has become one of perceived oppressor versus oppressed, of villain versus victim, and because little Israel, between the size of Maryland and New Jersey, has been put into a position that no country in the free world has faced, which is a full-scale attack on 8 fronts. It's almost unimaginable, but it's put Israel in a position of having to exercise massive power to defend itself, and it's in a war of existence that the West doesn't understand. The United States does not understand what an existential war is. So this notion that they've really got to choose, it's almost a binary choice today that wasn't when Ambassador, it began, I think, in earnest when Ambassador Oren was ambassador, but growing up in the 60s and 70s, that was not the choice.
There were other choices. The big choice back when I grew up was whether American Jews could be American and Jewish at the same time, which is basically the theme of every American Jewish novel of the 50s and the 60s. It's Philip Roth, it's Bernard Malamud, it's all these people. Can I be American and Jewish at the same time? Saul Bellow opens a book, Augie March, saying, I'm an American Chicago born. What is he basically saying in that line? Hey, I'm not Jewish. I'm American. I'm from Chicago. Today you ask that same question to American Jews, even like Haredi American Jews. Are you American and Jewish? Do you see any contradiction? They'll look at you. Not only do they not only do they don't have an answer, they don't even understand the question. Of course I'm American. I'm American as anybody else. Today there's a different question. Can you be a good American and be pro-Israel? And I, in my entirely too long travels across the United States and visiting multiple cities, again and again I come across American Jews who would say this election has presented me with a choice. I can either vote for America or I can vote for Israel. And it's important to state this, and I cannot overemphasize this, that while we are in a truly existential struggle, as Dan says, The American people think they are in an existential struggle, not because of bombs and rockets, but because of this election. The people who vote for Trump think that if Kamala Harris wins, it's the end of America. And the people who vote for Kamala Harris believe that if Trump wins, it's the end of American democracy. It's the end of the American project. And they truly, truly believe this. This is an existential election. And we'd have to look maybe back to 1861 to find an issue election I don't know. It's not even divisive isn't the word. I think the word is life and death.
I want to give a little bit of perspective to our listeners who might not necessarily understand the importance of the U.S. having a strong ally in the Middle East. Perhaps, Ambassador, you can give us a little bit of light given your experience.
Well, you can say that the U.S.-Israel strategic alliance, let's leave the common democratic values aside. Let's leave even the spiritual ties, which today, and I say this without reservation, is the deepest and most multifaceted strategic alliance, which the United States has had with any foreign power in the post-World War II period. And I'm including Great Britain in this. Because no other country has the degree of weapons and systems development that we have. It's every American destroyer carries an Israeli gun. Every American fighter pilot of a fixed-wing or a helicopter wears an Israeli-made helmet. Most American infantrymen and women carry a high-tech bandage that's made here in Jerusalem. That's just a small aspect of it. It is joint maneuvers, especially special forces training. The people who took out Osama bin Laden, SEAL Team 6, they trained here before they did it. It is anti-missile defense, which we all know about. We know about Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow 2, Arrow 3. It is, at the highest level, cyber security, cooperation, and intelligence. Intelligence. So you don't have this level of cooperation between the United States and France, the United States and Italy. The closest competitor would be Britain. But even then, today, the IDF is more than twice as large as the British and French armies combined. That's an asset. Now, convincing Americans of that, and even convincing them, or educating them rather, that the nearly $4 billion a year that the United States give us in military aid is actually a subsidy for the American arms market, that if you take away that aid, and everyone's threatening to take away the aid, not everyone, certain people are threatening to take away the aid, tens of thousands of Americans are going to be out of a job. I should say that for the last 5 years, I came back from Washington convinced that we should actually end the aid. And I've been one of the most outspoken critics of the aid for many reasons. And one of those reasons we see right now during this war. I was very much influenced by the decision by the Obama administration in the 2014 fighting with Gaza to withhold certain types of ammunition for us. And I came back and said, if we get into a larger conflict, this could become a major factor. And Israel has to strive for arms production independence.
Well, I think that goes back to that relationship of the big brother and the little brother, the Israeli little brother, where, like you said, that balance between the two, Israel has sort of had to ignore the big brother's advice, including during the Gaza war, not going to Rafah. We heard it over and over again from the Biden administration, don't go into Rafah, don't go into Rafah. And in the end, the Israelis ignored those
Don't go
concerns.
into Lebanon, don't bomb Beirut.
Don't bomb Iran.
Don't bomb Iran. At the end of the day, we always have to say to the United States, thank you, but here's our but. Okay? We get to say but too, but this is a paramount strategic national defense issue for the state of Israel, and we have to pursue it.
I think we have to make an additional point here that is not self-evident. Israel's determination and its implementation of its power in the last 31 days since the mysterious beeper counter-terror operation that took out the Hezbollah mid-level and senior command, that ended up killing Nasran Nasrallah, killed Sinwar, the Hamas command, and gained an unprecedented level of respect by the same Arab Muslim establishment in the Middle East that the United States has been trying to stabilize and enhance its relationship with. And it's paradoxical, because the U.S. understanding, which I think empirically now, as Michael has laid out so eloquently, has really been wrong in terms of achieving what the United States foreign policy and defense policy really wants to achieve in the Middle East. And Israel has been right. And when one understands that the Arab world suffers from cognitive dissonance, on the one hand, you see just recently the condemnations of the Arab League and of the Gulf Cooperation Council on Israel's attack against the Iranian regime. And on the other hand, under the radar, they're celebrating and tossing candies and calling us, thanking us. And I actually went on a phone call with a Gulf friend, very highly, strongly connected to the governments of the Gulf, said, thank you for fighting the Arabs' war against the Iranian regime. And that is what before we went on the air, Ambassador Oren and I were discussing, what is the messaging that we really have to convey to the United States in order to really shift what has become more and more of this divide? And I think the answer is to help them understand that it's the Arab moderate establishment, if you will, led by Saudi Arabia, that actually agrees with Israel's approach, as opposed to the traditional American approach, which is don't.
Alas. We were talking about this before the podcast, too. What degree are Americans, certainly American elites, open to that type of reasoning? Keep in mind, we're dealing with very deep-seated and long-standing worldviews that come out of universities, such as the ones that you graduated, I graduated, taught in. And those worldviews are, to my experience, almost impermeable to challenge. You look at the record of the United States in the Middle East, going back now almost 2 decades. Failure in North Africa, failure in Egypt, failure in Syria, failure in Yemen, failure in Iraq, failure in Iran, failure certainly in Israel, Palestine. You can't point to any success. The constant harping on the two-state solution, and I've been involved in the peace process for more than 30 years now, and I think that's simply the definition of insanity. But you would think that some of these very smart individuals would sit down and say, hey, what are we doing wrong? What are we not understanding about this region? These are elites who passionately believe in engagement, that they profoundly believe that the way to de-escalate in the Middle East is through de-escalation, by projecting fear and weakness. We don't want a war. We don't want to be in a regional war. Don't drag us in. And that's the way. Everyone's going to be nice to America after they say this. But I'm not being facetious here. This literally is their approach. Iran has, over the course of the last year, shot at American bases roughly 180 times. The United States has not fired one bullet against Iran, not exacted any price from Iran, when those 6 hostages were shot, including an American, Hirsch, Goldberg, Poland. President Biden says Hamas is going to pay dearly for this. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. In fact, the pressure was on Bibi the next day, on Netanyahu. They said that when Iran fired missiles at us, President Biden says, I'm going to G7, we're going to level sanctions. Anybody see any sanctions? Any severe sanctions? No. So the message to the Middle East is of a sort of American no-show. With people in Washington, it's also, war is the failure of diplomacy by all means. And they see, talk about cognitive dissonance. They see war as a contradiction with diplomacy. You want diplomacy to succeed? You've got to show strength.
You've said that the current war between Israel and Hezbollah, and of course the other Iranian proxies, is a golden ticket to change the face of the Middle East and end Iran's influence in the region. How critical is the next American president when it comes to that shift?
If Israel creates the situation, creates the conditions for creating a regional architecture, which, by the way, President Biden has talked about. A regional architecture. It would be a NATO-like organization in the Middle East. The cornerstone would be Israel-Saudi peace. It would have an economic and logistic component, railways linking all these countries. It's very good. But if it's not backed by power, it's not going to succeed.
You mentioned that Saudi deal that was very much on the table right before the October 7th attack.
I think it was partly responsible for the October attack. All right, so I said I wasn't prophetic, but here I'm going to contradict myself. On October 5th, I was giving a talk in Dallas, and I shocked my audience by saying Israel would soon be going to war. Gasp. I had been briefing diplomats about this too. I was very certain we're going to war. Why? Because the Biden administration was trying to forge this peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Part of the deal, Saudi Arabia was going to get nuclear power. And I said, if anybody thinks that the Iranians are going to sit quietly while the Saudis get nuclear power, they're kidding themselves. They're going to start a small war. I got the small part of it wrong. But there were other factors involved. One was the divisions within this country, and it's turned out from the documents we found from Hamas that actually was a consideration of theirs, that the divisions over the judicial reform, the pilots not showing up for reserve duty, and the divisions within the United States as well. But the Iranians were looking at the polls, and they saw that Donald Trump was in the lead. The Iranians are scared to death of Donald Trump because he is unpredictable. Predictability is a big liability in the Middle East. Absolutely. And that's what Trump doesn't represent. He doesn't represent predictability. And what can I say? You're right. In the Middle East, that's an asset.
Well, that's a very important point here, Sarah, because as we move forward into a post-election global reality, it's fundamentally important for the U.S.-led Western Alliance and people in the free world to understand that the war that the Iranian regime is prosecuting and has been prosecuting since 1979 has been a war against the United States and Israel. The first thing that Khomeini's regime and Khomeini himself said as he stepped off the Air France plane from Paris is death to America. And what they did in the beginning of the revolution was to kidnap 66 Americans and ended up holding 53 American women and men hostages for 444 days and freed them on January 20th, 1981, when Ronald Reagan stepped into his first day of the presidency. Death to America has become the headline of a 45-year war that many in the West, and particularly the United States, believe is a war between Israel and the Palestinians. This is the major misunderstanding that is at the peril of the United States military planners, politicians, government leaders, lawmakers. Israel must help them understand that this war that Israel is fighting, Israel is seen as the front line of the United States of America in the Middle East, as opposed to just being, the Jewish collective. It's a fundamentally important point, because this is why Ambassador Oren very rightly has said that the discourse in the United States, whether it's on the liberal left or whether it's on the more centrist or conservative right, is about what they call a two-state solution. It is an irrelevant point today, because Israel, in any what they call the day after plan, Israel will be forced to hold buffer territory to its north and southern Lebanon, up to the Litani River, just as the international community through UN Security Council Resolution 1701 called for back in 2006, as well as holding territories for its survival and existence in the south, in Gaza. This is something Israel didn't want. It's something that is forced upon Israel, and this is something that Israel needs unconditional understanding and political support across the lines in the United States, because we will not survive. The Jews will not survive if we don't have defensible borders.
But the point you have to make is that, okay, Jews will not survive, but America won't survive either.
That's right.
And that's the point
Ultimately,
we have to make. And we have a certain amount of, we bear a certain guilt for this. In the way Israeli policy has been conducted, certainly since 1993, since the Oslo Accords. I'll just give an example. I was present in a meeting with Shimon Peres, who was president at the time, and Secretary of State John Kerry. And Peres said the following, and this is almost a word for quote. We can't eliminate the Iranian nuclear program. You can't eliminate knowledge. So we have to eliminate the reason why they hate us. We have to create a Palestinian state. Now, if you believe that's the flip side of what you're saying about what Americans believe. But here Israelis believe that too.
That's right.
And Israelis who are very influential. And we have to, I think, disabuse ourselves. And it was very difficult for us to acknowledge that there is an enemy who for whom hope is not the same hope, that is not good, that is fundamentally evil, and that wouldn't care how many of their own people would be killed, how many would be unemployed, how many left homeless, in order to achieve its goal, which was destruction of Jews. It was very difficult, to, as they say, to wrap our heads around this. Who would have believed it? I was present in many meetings where we said, okay, we're going to let 20,000 Palestinian workers into Israel every day, and Hamas won't dare attack because it won't want to forfeit the great salaries and social benefits these people were giving.
It's been a very bloody lesson to embrace what used to be called an object lesson in university and high school, that ideology can trump economic or philosophical goodness, economic self-interest. In the Middle East, religiously fueled conflict, which is just jihad.
I've had, the privilege, the opportunity to actually participate in negotiations with the Palestinians. And it became clear to me during the course of the negotiations that this was not about territory, Dan. It wasn't about Jerusalem. It wasn't about it wasn't about settlements. It was about identity. Identity. And the message we got from the Palestinians was the following. You want us to recognize you as the Jewish state, which is their fundamental request in any negotiation, because that's how we establish mutual legitimacy. We were going to recognize them as the Palestinian state. They had to recognize us as the Jewish state. You can have two states, but if one is illegitimate, then you'd have immediate irredenta the next day. You want us to recognize you as the Jewish state. Don't you understand that by doing that, you're asking us to negate our own identity? And at that point, you realize all those years we spent in college was complete waste. All I had to do was hear that one line. Because what he was basically saying was, you Jews wake up every morning, and you're Jews because of your 4,000-year history, because of the Bible, because of all these things that make us Jews and Israelis. Not because you're not Palestinians, but we wake up in the morning, and we're Palestinians because we're not you. And by acknowledging your legitimacy and existence, we cease to exist. What a remarkable moment that was. Remarkable moment.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you understand what we're dealing with. It's even beneath theology. It's, talk about identity politics. This is
completely, it's a poster child for identity politics.
But it's real as opposed to identity politics. This is real identity.
That's right.
That's ersatz identity.
That's right. That's where, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, derives from, as Michael said, this negation of the other. The negation of the Jewish people essentially celebrates and legitimizes the existence of the other, and it's an impossible calculus. You can't square that circle. By
focusing on the two-state solution, which is simply not going to happen, and there are myriad reasons. It's not just one reason, not the least of which that neither Israelis nor Palestinians want it. Is that it closes the door to other solutions, at least other venues of giving diplomatic horizons to both Israelis and Palestinians. And one of them is a federal solution or a cantonment solution on the Swiss model. And there are other ways you can go. But by constantly harping on this formula, which has not the slightest chance of success, you basically do immense disservice to Palestinians and Israelis both.
Michael, speaking of the Jewish state and the future of what this region will look like, you recently released a new book, 2048, The Rejuvenated State. You get the pun. In Hebrew, what's it called? In Hebrew, Medina Yehudit. It's written in English, in Arabic, and in Hebrew. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about the idea behind this book. So this idea grew out of a conversation I had with the Prime Minister. I was the deputy in the Prime Minister's office when I was in politics, and we would, talk at late hours of the night about books. And one night we together lamented the fact that Israelis are so bogged down in our daily crisis that we never really think about the future. We never really get a vision. So I said, well, let's do a project called 2048, which would be a vision of Israel on our 100th birthday. And what policies do we have to adopt now in order to ensure a second century of success, security, prosperity, etc. And once I started digging into it, you realize that this was a much more complex question. The government fell. For a year, I conducted discussions on 2048 with Nathan Sharansky at the Hartman Institute. Then Corona hit, and I retired to the room and wrote this.
The book is in English all of 80 pages. It's divided into 22 chapters that cover pretty much every aspect of Israeli society, foreign relations, the peace process, relations with the diaspora, the need for judicial review. By the way, judicial reform, written a couple of years before what happened in 2022, 2023, and defense issues. Among them, the complacency and the dependence on American arms. All of that is in there. Talk about, prophecy, prescience. I wouldn't change a word of it today. I'd add a few paragraphs, but it's pretty much there. And the book is really designed to elicit response, to get a conversation going about our future. Recommend you read it and get angry at it, throw it at the wall, say the guy's crazy, off his rocker. But let's talk about our future. And it's how difficult is that to do it right now, where we have to think about, can we make it to next week? All right. But this is, as they say in biblical Hebrew, dafka, the time to be talking about our future.
Absolutely.
Right.
Ambassador Michael Oren, thank you very much for this
Sarah.
fascinating conversation. Dr. Dan Diker.
Thank you,
as well.
Dr. Dan Diker. Thank you, everybody.